back to OZK 150. We're going to be talking about religion in the Ozarks today. And before we do, of course, we've got this week's March Madness edition. Not sure what the date is if you're watching this on film, but here in this world, it's March and basketball season, if you like that kind of thing. So we've got a basketball-themed famous Ozarkers. No, but it's you're on the right track there, as a matter of fact. So you might know who these ladies are. I bet somebody's heard of them once I tell you who they are. The All-American Redheads. Anybody ever heard of the All-American Redheads?
Yeah.
Long-time women's barnstorming basketball team who started their life here in the Ozarks, down in southwest Missouri at Cassville. They were founded by a guy who was kind of a professional basketball barnstormer named Ole Olson. And Olson in the 1920s had his own men's team that toured around. If you don't know the term barnstorm, the Harlem Globetrotters are barnstormers. That's an old term that refers to traveling teams that go from town to town playing whoever they play. And barnstorming teams used to be much more common than they are now in baseball and basketball. Today, we've got the Globetrotters and donkey basketball, and that's about it, as far as the barnstormers go. But the Redheads were very popular back for many years. When I was a kid, I remember watching the Redheads play. They were, by that time, this was probably in the 70s, and they came to the little school that I went to. And by that time, they were more or less kind of a middle America phenomenon. They weren't traveling probably as widely as they once had. And the fact that they were playing in Violet Hill, Arkansas, tells me they probably, had passed their peak of popularity by that time. But they were still considered a big thing when I was a kid. And I remember there was this one big picture in the lobby of the gym that I went to, where I went to school. And it was a redhead. There was a girl who graduated from our school who had become one of the redheads, and she was kind of the school hero. And I think she had died young or something, and so they had this big picture of her, framed picture of her out in the lobby of the gym. She's not one of these. She came along much later. This picture is probably taken in the 40s. It looks kind of 40s-ish. The car and the hairdos and stuff like that. But the All-American Redheads were inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame just a couple of years ago. Yeah. Yeah.
Were there any famous athletes that came out of this?
Oh, I'm sure, well, within that world, I'm sure they were. I can't think of any right now.
It must have been
Yeah.
a huge turnover.
Yeah. I think, I believe Hazel Walker may have been a redhead, and she was a well-known basketball player. But, yeah, they were, during their heyday in the 40s and 50s and 60s, a lot of these women would have been quite well known. You didn't have to be a natural redhead to play for the Redheads. They could take care of that, and most of them, I'm sure, probably weren't.
Was the team ever integrated?
Not that I know of. You mean, did any black players ever play? I don't know that. I've seen lots of pictures of the Redheads all the way up into in the 1980s, and I never remember seeing a black player. Yeah. But, yeah. The All-American Redheads. Lacey, you were born just a generation too late. There you. Okay. Our word or our phrase for today is Sal Coon. Most of you probably use this phrase on a regular basis. It means what it obviously means, but it also means something else, or it did mean something else in the Ozarks, something unexpected. What would you say? What would the first thing you think of when somebody says a Sal Coon? What would that be?
Not complimentary.
Well, not complimentary. Well, that not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. You know.
Like a female raccoon.
Right, a female raccoon. That would be the most basic meaning of a Sal Coon. But for many people in the Ozarks, it was a slang term for a tornado. And well, it makes more sense if you've ever tangled with a mother raccoon. Referring to a tornado as a Sal Coon would make much more sense, and as someone who's actually done hand-to-hand combat, unfortunately, with a mad raccoon, I can kind of speak to the tornado quality of that. You know, it's sort of what's on the cartoon? What was the cartoon character? Tasmanian Devil. This is sort of the Ozark version of that. If you think of, the Tasmanian Devil, just this whirlwind of, and you just kind of mows down everything in his path. Well, yeah, if you go at it with a Sal Coon, yeah, you might think you've been in a tornado after a while. And it's also the name of a mountain down in Stone County.
There are no mountains in Stone County.
Well, at hills. There you go. Yeah, it's actually called Sal Coon Mountain, even though it's not. You're right. You have been learning things in this class. That technically it is not a mountain. Sal Coon Mountain Hill, we'll call it. And I don't really know where in Stone County that is, but it's somewhere down there, probably around the lake somewhere. Have you been there?
Yeah, I climbed it.
Oh, did you?
Koi ball.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it a bald hill?
Not ball, no.
Okay.
They just call it koi ball.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, good. Stop by Sal Coon Mountain on your way to Cassville to see where the redheads, Stone County, Berry County, right next to each other. So, all right. Okay, we're learning stuff already. All right, religion in the Ozarks. Now, we're going to, part of this will be history. Of course, a lot of what we've talked about this semester has been grounded in history of some sort, going back before the Civil War, so we'll do a little bit of that. And then we'll talk about the current religious patterns in the Ozarks a bit as well. And we'll start off with the history part of this, because that's what kind of sets the stage for religion in the Ozarks. And if you're from the Ozarks or you've spent much time driving around the Ozarks, if you've taken your Ozark road trip yet, it's one of the reasons I ask students to pay attention to things like churches, the kinds of churches you see out in the rural Ozarks. They can differ from place to place, but for the most part, over the vast majority of the Ozarks region, what you're going to find are typically the same group of churches represented. And this has to do with history. It has to do with the people who settled here before the Civil War and the kinds of religious beliefs that they brought with them, the places that they came from. And when you look at the early settlers of the Ozarks, the white settlers that we've talked about, most of them, about roughly 75% of them, who came over before the Civil War fell into either the Methodist or the Baptist group. And of course, if you know much about Baptists, you know that there are lots and lots of different kinds of Baptists. And Baptists, because Baptists are congregational, and they're decentralized for the most part. They often have disagreements with each other and split apart and form new churches where 2 or more Baptists are gathered in His name. There will be 2 or more Baptist churches. That's pretty much the way it goes. A Methodist, not hardly to that extent, but we'll talk about them as well. But before the Civil War, these were the groups. Numbers, and anytime you talk about religious census numbers, it's always inexact. The Census Bureau at different times in history has tried to count the number of religious adherents to certain denominations and certain churches. It's an inexact sort of thing because you're relying on people to volunteer, and sometimes, still today, there are churches in the United States that really don't want to report their numbers, that don't want to tell the government how many of them there are. There are some denominations, some churches who count everybody from 1 day old to 99 plus. And other churches only count people who have been baptized as adults or have consented to be baptized into a church. So it's really kind of tricky when you're talking about religion and census numbers. But what we can say is at the time of the Civil War, roughly just over 40% of religious adherents living in the Ozarks were Methodists. That was the largest single body of religious people in all the Ozarks. Methodists made up just over 40% of the population. Now, keep in mind that at that time, in the years before and up to the Civil War, the majority of people in the Ozarks weren't actively affiliated with any church of any kind. And a lot of times that was just because of how scattered and how small the population was in a certain area. The nearest church might be 20 miles away, and 20 miles away in 1860 was, might as well be 150 miles away today. It was impractical to attend services. We'll see how some churches got around that. But of the ones who actually reported membership or affiliation with some kind of religious group, more than 40% of them were Methodists, the most popular group. About a third of them, 33%, or about a third of those reporting some kind of religious affiliation were Baptists. So Methodist and Baptist together, about 3 out of 4 people living in the Ozarks who had some kind of religious affiliation or preference were either Methodist or Baptist. Still be a pretty good percentage today of people who are Methodist or Baptist. Wouldn't be that high of a percentage, but still 2 very popular denominations in the Ozarks today. Of the remaining 25%, roughly 10% of the total, not 10% of the other 25%, but 10% of all the people living in the Ozarks at the time of the Civil War were Presbyterians. And there were different kinds of Presbyterians as well. Probably most of the Presbyterians living in the Ozarks at the time of the Civil War were what we call Cumberland Presbyterians. And there aren't that many Cumberland Presbyterians anymore. There aren't really that many Presbyterians anymore compared to other groups. But the Cumberland Presbyterians were more popular in the Ozarks than the regular Presbyterians. And then the so-called Christians, and these are groups who were often referred to as the disciples of Christ before the Civil War. There's a big Disciples of Christ church on National. There may be one right next to campus somewhere as well. But there's still a denomination today called the Disciples of Christ. But most of the descendants of these Christians in the Ozarks today are members of the Church of Christ. So if you grew up in a Church of Christ or you know anything about the Church of Christ, most of the people in the Ozarks who come from this tradition are now called Church of Christ. But they come out of this same the same heritage as the disciples of Christ. And usually before the Civil War, they just referred to themselves as Christians. But they made up about 6% of the total. So if you add all of those up, all four of these main groups, you got over 90% of the people in the Ozarks. If you did the math there, it's about 90 or 91% of all the people in the Ozark region. Now we talked about the German immigration into the fringes of the Ozarks, the Mississippi Valley, the Missouri Valley, and in fact, we'll see a map in a minute that shows you where most of that settlement was. But those Germans who came to the Ozarks in the years before the Civil War, in the 25 years or so before the Civil War, were generally divided into three groups: Roman Catholics, and probably there were more Catholics who came to the Missouri Ozarks probably than the other two groups, the Lutherans and the German Reformed. But all three of these were represented on the fringes of the Ozarks. Again, in those places where today most people would tell you, we don't live in the Ozarks, even though the landscape looks real Ozarky. It's hill in a lot of these places where the Germans settled. It's hillier than it is here in the Springfield area, and looks like the Ozarks. But culturally, they may not consider it part of the Ozarks, and a lot of that has to do with German heritage. With kind of separating themselves from what they see as the real Ozarkers, the hillbilly Ozarkers who tend to be Baptist and Methodists. Different. But so you got these groups who make up roughly the other 10% or so of religious adherents. And one of the things that marks religion in the Ozarks, especially when you're talking about Protestant religion, and as we can see, the vast majority of people who lived in the Ozarks up until the Civil War were Protestants, and still today, a majority of people who live in the Ozarks are Protestant, was that they tended to be from what we might call the people's churches, or what you might call the common churches. You saw very few Episcopalians in the Ozarks. You saw very few old school Presbyterians in the Ozarks. The churches that tended to have traditions where their ministers went to college, and the churches that often were made up of the wealthier people in a community. When you did see Episcopal churches or old school Presbyterian churches, they were almost always in town somewhere. They were rarely out in the countryside. They would be in Springfield or in one of the bigger towns of the Ozarks, and often made up of merchants and lawyers and doctors and your better off farmers and things like that. But most of the vast majority of people in the Ozarks, being common people, belong to some of these common churches. And it goes back to where these people came from. If you remember, earlier in the semester, we talked about the migration patterns, and we talked about people migrating here from Tennessee and Kentucky and even farther back east in that kind of southern upland area. And if you go back to the early 1800s, when the migrations first start of white people coming to the Ozarks, that's the very age when you're having all of these great revivals in places like Tennessee and Kentucky. And the churches that are really benefiting from these revivals, from what in religious history we call the Second Great Awakening, from this widespread revival out in the Southwest, are the Methodists and the Baptists, especially the Cumberland Presbyterians, the Christians. Those are the groups that are growing by leaps and bounds, by getting people coming to these large camp meetings. We'll hear a description of an early Missouri camp meeting in a minute. And this was all part of what was going on for these people who were migrating to Missouri and Arkansas. And it's no surprise that they bring these religious movements with them. And often when they get to Missouri and Arkansas, they're recreating these camp meetings and this revival spirit and growing, especially the Baptist and the Methodist. We'll talk about both. We'll hear from both the Baptist and Methodist ministers in the early days of Missouri before the Civil War. But that's in large part why Missouri develops religiously the way it does. It's the people who come here bring their religious beliefs with them, just as the Germans who came here in the 1840s and 50s brought their religious beliefs with them, whether that was Catholicism or Lutheranism or whatever it was. They just came in smaller numbers and tended to be along the fringes of the region. So there's something to be said for history and the survival of this legacy all the way into the 21st century. Now this, as you can see, is a map from 2000. And if you're like me and you love maps with color on them, you'll love this map. One of the best ever. And this is, again, using what religious statistics we have. And this is a map that shows county to county across the United States the single largest religious denomination in each county. And if you're sitting on the back or you can't see that far, what is red? Right. This is the Baptist belt. And if you look at the Baptist belt, that doesn't mean that a majority of the people who live in the red counties are Baptists. It just means that there are more Baptists than there are any other single group in those counties. And you can see that in the Ozarks of North Arkansas and southern Missouri, this is firmly within the Baptist belt. In this way, the Ozarks is sort of an extension of the greater South. Of course, when we're looking at the red there, you're looking at the South pretty much. A lot of that's the old Confederacy. And so much of the Ozarks is today dominated by Baptists, not Methodists. And there are any number of reasons why the Baptists have held on and expanded and the Methodists have actually contracted. We won't go into those in here. I do teach American religious history, so anyone who's interested in that one of these days, we can talk about that in there. But there are a couple of exceptions. If you look at the fringe counties along the Mississippi River and along the Missouri River, where there was heavy German settlement, they've got the light blue, and that's Catholic. So that means that Catholics make up the largest single group in some of these fringe counties along the northern and northeastern part of the Ozarks. Counties like Gasconade and Osage, Franklin, St. John, Perry, some of those counties up in there. And then there's this one yellow county right in the middle. Does anybody know what county that is? It's Ozark County. And Ozark County is yellow, which says here yellow is Christian. So that means in Ozark County, almost all of the groups who fall into that category of Christian, it's not general Christian, but specifically the denomination that we talked about earlier with the name Christian are going to be Church of Christ. So that just means there are lots of churches of Christ in Ozark County, and the people who are members of the Church of Christ make up a larger population than any other single group, even counting Baptists. Now, there would be several other counties in this region where the Christians would probably be a close second to Baptists, but that's the only county where they actually surpass the Baptists.
What's the light blue?
Are you talking about like this? Or,
No, the second.
oh, this one? That says Reformed. Well, and Reformed can mean lots and lots of different things. It can mean like the Reformed, the German Reformed Church or the Dutch Reformed Church.
Those counties in Michigan.
Yeah.
It looks like where Holland is located. There's a lot of Dutch.
So it's probably Dutch Reformed there.
And then what's the orange up north?
That's probably going to be Lutheran. Yeah, that's Lutheran up in
That's your
Scandinavian. Yeah, yeah. You can see there are certain patterns that emerge on this map, and a lot of it has to do with migration patterns to the United States. So, there are special cases, Utah and the Mormons and surrounding counties on the border of Utah. So there are those special cases. And even in the South is overwhelmingly Protestant and largely Baptist on this map, but you do have your exceptions in the South, like southern Louisiana, which is Catholic. Again, heritage thing, the French influence there. You've got your kind of Latin part of Florida, and also lots of retirees in Florida, that kind of thing. And you've got this sprinkling of yellow counties around. What's the green? And green, you can see here, the green is Methodist, and the Methodists have sort of been conquered in the Ozarks and lots of other places by the Baptists. But and part of that has to do with the fact that if you counted groups that were from the Methodist tradition, and that would include groups like Pentecostals, then you could say, from a historical standpoint, the Methodists still have a huge influence on the Ozarks. But so many people who came from that Methodist tradition left the Methodist Church and founded or joined Pentecostal churches. Pentecostalism grows out of Methodism in the late 1800s. Actually, it grows out of the Holiness movement, which grew out of Methodism. So that's where the roots are. But a really neat map. You can even see there are a handful of Mennonite counties, the pink counties, or purple. I'm not sure exactly what color that is. Purpley pink. Not the color you really associate with Mennonites. But, one of our best sources, or among our best sources for finding out what religious life was like in the early days of the Ozarks, are the memoirs and the accounts that were written often by ministers who traveled the region before the Civil War. In lots of places in the frontier-like United States, the minister was often the most educated person in a community, or the most educated person to pass through a community, even if they weren't a college-educated minister. And most often the early Baptist and Methodist ministers of the Ozarks of Arkansas and Missouri weren't college-educated. They were still often more educated, more literate than the people that they were preaching to. And some of them left accounts behind to tell us a little bit about what life was like and what the churches were like in those days. And this is an account, one of the earliest accounts that we have that fit into this category was written by a Baptist missionary by the name of John Mason Peck. And John Mason Peck came to Missouri very early on. He came here around 1818, 1819, right just before Missouri became a state, and wrote several accounts of his experiences that he had. And I'll just read you a couple of brief things that he wrote that have to do with his travels and his preaching at different places in the Ozarks. He spent time in lots of different places in Missouri, but he did spend time in the Ozarks of southeast Missouri when there weren't many people settled there, when settlement was still in the very early days. And here's, let's see here, he writes, he's writing about finding fellow Baptists who have different beliefs than he did. Remember, I mentioned that Baptists often disagreed with each other, and because of the congregational system, you sort of believe what you want to believe within a certain parameter. But here's what he writes about some of the Baptists that he encountered in frontier Missouri. A set of crude and erroneous notions had been stereotyped in their minds in Kentucky. So many of the early Missouri settlers came from Kentucky. He blames it on Kentucky here for stamping these people with ignorance before they turned them loose and they came to Missouri. About gospel doctrine and moral obligation, and they were fixedly resolved to learn nothing else. They maintained that missions, Sunday schools, Bible societies, and such like facilities were all men's contrivances to take God's work out of His own hands. Their view of the plan of salvation through Christ was exceedingly limited and imperfect, and their success was quite as limited as their biblical knowledge was deficient. So Peck was an educated guy who came to the frontier of Missouri, and as you can imagine, the people he encountered on the frontier of Missouri were frontiers people. They were wearing coonskin hats and buffalo robes and things like that, and they weren't exactly his kind of people. And they often tended to be more conservative, more set in their ways in terms of their religious beliefs. And Peck was a missionary, and a lot of these people believed, as still a lot of Baptists today believe, that missionary work should be carried out by individual churches, that you shouldn't pay missionaries to go in the field, that you're kind of using money for wrong purposes if you pay missionaries. And this is what he's reacting to. They see him roll in and they think, oh, here's one of these missionaries, wasting our money. Guy looking around for a chicken dinner. That's what preachers do, right? You just go from house to house eating chicken. You always get the best meal when you show up. But that was a little bit of John Mason Peck. And then I've got one other brief comment that he makes. This is, he attends a church in St. Francis County over in the eastern part of the Ozarks. It's a church it's a log cabin church, just kind of out in the middle of the woods. And of the people who attend the church, this is a preacher writing this. You'd think he'd be a little more diplomatic, but he's not. He says, they were stupid, listless, and apparently indifferent to everything. The people throughout these extreme frontier settlements were quite ignorant. Few could read, and fewer families had Bibles. They knew not the name of a single missionary on earth and could not comprehend the reasons why money should be raised for the expenses or why ministers should leave their own neighborhood to preach the gospel to the destitute. So you can kind of read between the lines and figure out that he's probably not receiving an open arms welcome at some of these places, and he's reacting negatively to some of the people that he comes into contact with. And that's not something that would just happen with Baptist preachers. You would find that kind of culture clash, the more educated Easterner coming out west. You found that in all kinds of accounts of the early days of the Ozarks, but that's one of the better ones there that has to do specifically with religion. But Peck did spend years and years traveling around Missouri trying to both Christianize and civilize the people that he encountered in the Ozarks and other parts of Missouri as well. And so that's the Baptist view. And this is from a Methodist circuit rider. Now, one of the ways that the Methodists were able to be so popular and to grow so rapidly in the years before the Civil War was that they used something called a circuit riding preacher. The Methodists didn't require that their preachers be educated, and that was good for the frontier. Very few people wanted to spend 3 or 4 years in college or a seminary and then get out and all of a sudden go to Missouri or Arkansas on the frontier somewhere. So that was, just about anybody who said they had a calling to preach could become a preacher, whether a Baptist or Methodist. So the Methodists would hire these almost always single young men. They preferred single young men, using the example of the Apostle Paul. If you've read Paul's letters, he wasn't a big fan of marriage and thought that wives tended to get in the way of the Lord's work. And the early Methodists followed the same sort of teaching. And so they would hire these usually single young men. They would send them out and they would assign them to a circuit. And a circuit was made up of sometimes many, many congregations over a 5 or 6 county area, sometimes a smaller area, depending on how sparse the population was. But that's what a circuit was. And you would, on your circuit, you would ride, usually by horseback, from one congregation to the next. And you would preach whenever you showed up there. If it was Thursday night, well, here we go. Here's the Thursday night service. If it was Saturday morning, you might have church. You just you preach to each one of your congregations whenever you get there. A lot of times you would just be preaching in somebody's house, and they would go out and gather up some of their neighbors to come over and listen. But that's one way that the Methodist Church grew so rapidly, is by sending these people out to where the people were and serving them by, assigning them to many different churches. And one of the early circuit riders in the southeast Missouri Ozarks was this Methodist preacher named Jerome C. Berryman, or J.C. Berryman. And I don't think I have any quote from him, but here's just an example. In the 1830s, I believe it was. Let's see. It would have been the 1830s. He gets assigned to what was called the St. Francis Circuit. So it was the St. Francis County area it included the counties of St. Francis, St. Genevieve, Perry, Madison, and Wayne. So he had 5 counties. And it took him about 4 weeks to make a complete circuit from one to the next. So basically, you get the preacher once a month. That's pretty much what happens. And he's either on the road from one congregation to the next, or he's preaching at a congregation every day. And it was a terribly hard life. They were paid almost nothing. He mentioned that his first year as a circuit rider, he made $16. That's what the Methodist Church paid him. His second year, he got a huge raise to $25. Almost retired on that. But one of the things that the circuit riding Methodist preachers often did, and Berryman mentions that he did this, was that they would sell books and pamphlets and things like that as they traveled around, and they got to keep a cut of the book sales that they made. And they were always some sort of religious themed book, usually books that were printed by the Methodist Church and were meant to answer various questions that people would have about religion and Christ and different things. So he got paid very little, but if you were a good salesman, and oftentimes being a good preacher is being a good salesman, if you were a good salesman, then you could at least make a little bit. But for most circuit riding preachers, this was something you did for a few years until you almost killed yourself. And then it was common to get married and settle down, to try to get an appointment in a larger town somewhere where you just had one church and you could just stay there. Or you could do what Berryman did and go to the Indian Territory and become a missionary to Indians. But that was an example of a Methodist circuit rider in southeast Missouri. And here's another circuit riding Methodist minister, and this is one that we actually have a diary. This was a minister by the name of Jacob Lanius, and he kept a diary of his travels and his preachings in the 1830s and 1840s, and it's a really neat sort of thing. He's very, very, as many of these ministers were, he's very sectarian. What does that mean? If I say someone is very sectarian. It means, in this context, it would mean, that's exactly right, but it means that he's,
You're a Baptist, you're a Methodist, you're a Methodist.
that's exactly right. A sectarian is, I found the right way and the rest of you are wrong. Yeah, and you better come around to my way of thinking, or hell may await you. And so he was very sectarian. He believed that the Methodists had figured it out and that everybody else was either way off or just a little bit off. Depending on how. If you were Catholic, you were way off. You were working for the devil as far as the Methodists were concerned. And in some places in his diary, he has very negative things to say about Catholics. He rarely mentions them because most of the places where he worked, there weren't any Catholics. But he didn't have anything good to say about them. And we'll read in a minute what he had to say about Springfield when he came through, and the religious atmosphere in Springfield. He wasn't happy about the people who seemed to control Springfield either, but they weren't Catholics. We'll see who they were. But he mentions, and this gives you a little taste of the early days of Missouri and how important religion was to some people and how hard it was for some people to be exposed to religious services. He mentions in one place, and remember, he's like Berryman was. He's traveling from congregation to congregation, preaching. And he mentions going to one place in 1836 to preach at a Methodist congregation. And a woman came to the church who had walked 25 miles to come to this. She had walked 25 miles. And she told him that since she had moved from Tennessee 2 years earlier, this was the first time that she had seen a Methodist preacher or been to a Methodist church service. And she was so excited. Somehow word had got to her that this guy was going to be at such and such a church, and she'd walked 25 miles to get there. So quite a... and fortunately, he didn't refer to her as stupid or listless like one of our earlier preachers did. He talks about... he has some really good descriptions of camp meetings. And one of the ways that these churches, like the Methodist Church, grew so quickly in these years before the Civil War was through something called the camp meeting, which is basically an outdoor revival that lasted several days. They would, you can see up there the very first one, brush arbor revivals. By the 20th century, we're calling these brush arbors. And the brush arbor comes from, you remember the film we watched after the midterm, and they were building the little brush arbor over in Shannon County. Well, that's what that comes from, only this is pre-Civil War, and they called them camp meetings because people back in those days, with the limits of transportation, would literally go and camp out wherever the camp meeting was going to be held. And they would build these temporary structures. Yeah, some of the camp meetings back in Kentucky and Tennessee would attract thousands of people. And they would go on sometimes for a week or more. And we'll see some of these early Missouri camp meetings were very much like that, very long. Some of them were interdenominational in that they would include Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist preachers. Sometimes they were just one denomination. If you were like this guy and you weren't really all that fond of a lot of the other denominations, you might prefer the ones that were just Methodist. Though he mentions both kinds in there. He doesn't always have bad things to say about Presbyterians, but most other people he doesn't seem to like. But this is July 1836. And if you remember, the brush arbor that we saw in the Shannon County film, I think was in summertime, or at least they were in short sleeves, and it looked like, it was green and stuff like that. Why do you think the camp meetings happened in... This one was, he mentions it starts around the end of July, 1836.
Because they weren't planting and they weren't harvesting.
That's right. It was during the lay-in-by period. We may have talked about that in here before. I don't remember. But in the late summer, there comes a point, if you're a farmer, and especially if you're raising some kind of crops, corn or wheat or cotton or whatever the crops are. Well, a lot of the wheat in the Ozarks was harvested in the spring, but whatever you're growing, there comes a time when you lay your crops by. When you say, okay, they've gotten so tall to a certain point where the weeds aren't going to smother them out anymore. There's not a lot I can do to help them along. And it's hotter than the dickens outside. And so there was this kind of lull in the late summer when the people of the Ozarks and the people of rural America in general would have a little bit of time on their hands to go fishing or whatever. And that's almost always when these camp meetings would be held. It's during this lay-in-by period when people could actually go leave their homes for a week and camp out and go to these sermons day after day after day and listen to all this stuff. And so he starts one of these camp meetings in late July of 1836. He's somewhere in southeastern Missouri. I don't see exactly where it is. But he writes, "It was quite amusing to see the people come for 20 miles around about, bell and hobble their horses and turn them out to graze in the open forest. And it was quite musical to hear the bells of the horses and oxen all around the encampment. The people and the whole appearance of things were plain and old-fashioned, as should always be the case at camp meetings." That's his editorial, that they should always be old-fashioned. He mentions at this camp meeting that there were 2 Methodist ministers, there was a Baptist minister, And there was a black Methodist minister at this camp meeting in 1836. And they were all preaching, and they may take turns. Two of them may be preaching at the same time, one on one part of the campground and the other on another part of the campground. These things just kind of took on a life of their own. And he writes about 15 mourners coming to the altar, and their cries for mercy were hideous and awful beyond description of my pen. And then he goes on to further describe this camp meeting, which lasted for 12 days. I mean, this was a humdinger of a revival, almost 2 weeks long. Now, that doesn't mean everybody was there for the whole 12 days, but people were coming in and out of this revival for 12 days. He writes, for 10 days, the encampment seemed all a heaven filled with God. Here was seen the girl of 8 and the boy of 10 praising God who had blessed their souls. And here was seen the pious wife bringing the wicked husband to the altar of solemn prayer and then weeping over his sins as over his grave. It's always the husband who's the wicked one in these stories. Here the mourning of scores was turned to joy and a new song put into their mouths, even praises to God. Such bursts of glory were scarcely ever witnessed in this section of the country. And he mentioned, and then he later goes on to say, such a camp meeting as this I never witnessed in my life. The like has never been seen in this part of the world, so say the oldest settlers. Within the last month in the settlement of Bellevue, and that's over south of Potosi in that area, about 160 souls have been converted. I feel so thankful I know not what to do. And so it's a pretty remarkable description of one of these early camp meetings by someone who was participating, or someone who was a preacher in one of these camp meetings. And let's see, where's the spring? The last thing we'll look at. He actually, as I mentioned, he comes to Springfield a couple years later. He spends most of his time on a circuit in southeast Missouri, but he's later assigned to a circuit in southwest Missouri. And he actually preaches at least one time in Springfield. And he writes, and he's talking about Springfield, this little village is almost overrun by Camel Lights. Does anybody know what a Camel Light is?
Camel?
No.
Can't say it.
Campbell, or it's written Campbell Light. He would have pronounced it Camel Light, like the cigarette.
Those people, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Camels?
Well, the Campbells were the early settlers of Springfield, but in this case, what he's talking about are the Christians, the disciples of Christ Christians. They're one of the founders of that movement was a guy named Campbell, Alexander Campbell, and they were often derisively referred to by Baptist and Methodist and other non-disciples of Christ as Campbellites. In those days, they pronounced Campbell camel, as if it were C-A-M-E-L. And so they called them Camel Lights. And you can still hear, you get out in the rural Ozarks, you may still hear people refer to the Church of Christ as Camelites or Campbellites. But he writes, the village is almost overrun by Campbellites, followers of Joel Hewden and Dr. McBride, the former register in the land office and the latter a practicing physician, both proclaimers of the ancient gospel. And he puts these in quotation marks. He's kind of making fun of their stance. Proclaimers of the ancient gospel, which indeed is another gospel. They have introduced damnable heresy and thereby drawn many away from the faith delivered unto the saints. So he's obviously no fan of the Campbellites. And when he calls their doctrine damnable heresy, that's about as strong as you can get from this preacher. And so they join the Catholics as people he just doesn't trust at all. But the disciples of Christ were a strong group in southwest Missouri and south central Missouri in those days.
What did they do for 12 days? I mean, they didn't have the lawn chairs to sit on, and they didn't have coolers full of food.
Well, and they would bring food. Of course, they didn't have coolers, like you say. But they would pack food, even if it was, smoked pork of some sort and bread, cornbread or something. But they would basically live out of their wagons, like we would take a minivan and live out of that. The women and children might sleep in the back of the wagon, the men underneath it or something like that. So they would bring their wagons. They might even put up a tent or bring a wagon with the canopy over the back of it. So and as far as where they sit, they would often make just sort of these rough benches for people to sit on. But one of the things you have to remember too, these camp meetings, put yourself back in, say, 1836, where Lanius is, somewhere in southeast Missouri, somewhere in the Potosi area of southeast Missouri. There's not a whole lot of socializing, not a whole lot of opportunities to socialize in those days, especially if you're a farm family, as the vast majority of these people were. And so the camp meeting becomes more than a religious experience, it becomes a social event.
Like an extended NASCAR weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, it does, you go and you camp out. I mean, there are some similarities there, it's, or go into the, in this case, it's the whole family goes, and, if you want to drop by one of the sermons, do it. If you're a teenager, it's a perfect place to meet other teenagers and do your sparking. And, there was dating, getting to know, others. And there was no secret at these camp meetings that kind of stuff went on. In fact, I read an account, this was an earlier account, early 1800s, camp meeting that was going on over in Kentucky, where they had a small church house, and they would some people would sleep in the church house, and they would put the women on one side, the men on the other side, and the ministers would sleep in the middle. Now, a lot of us would say that's probably the worst people to have in the middle, right? You could put the preachers in there, but we've heard all the stories, Jimmy Swaggart and all these stories about ministers, but that actually happened, and it may have been a similar thing to what would happen here, and there was probably some procreating going on at these camp meetings. They were social events, so lots of stuff. There are thickets in the Ozarks. There are places to get off.
Big fair. I mean, the kids would be off playing somewhere.
Yeah.
Some guys preaching over here, because they'd preach for hours, didn't they?
Yeah, they could, yeah. And then, take turns. And when you got multiple preachers, tag team, I'm out,
You had to set up outhouses or something someplace.
You could, although you have to remember, in these days, almost no one had outhouses. People, you use...
You designate an area?
Yeah, designate an area of the woods. If you're close to the woods, that's the roost pole. I think we talked about roost poles earlier. That's where you go to relieve yourself. And you might have a men's section and a women's section. Well, it probably just depended. Some of these things just kind of took on a life of their own, and there may literally be preaching all day at some of these. And you have to remember too that even though the groups that we call Pentecostals today are really a 20th century phenomenon, they don't come along until right around 1900 and explode in the early 1900s. The same things that we associate with Pentecostals today were often going on at these camp meetings. People speaking in tongues, people claiming that they'd been healed, jumping over benches and getting the Spirit, that kind of stuff. And Lanius talks about that in his diary. Again, as I mentioned, Pentecostalism later grows out of the holiness movement, which grows out of the Methodist church. And Lanius was very obviously, if you kind of know the background of the holiness movement, when you read his diary, you realize that he was an early holiness Methodist. He was in favor of getting the Spirit and getting happy at these meetings, and Was an emotional sort of guy. And so that, that kind of stuff's happening as well. And that might go on all night if you get a especially fervent crowd and a preacher who's really riled up. That could, yeah. Well, again, if you're kind of camped out there, it's like NASCAR weekend. You're not always watching the race, right? Sometimes you're people watching. Most of the time you're people watching, probably at a NASCAR event. You're at the concession stand. You're kind of milling around. It's probably a good place to get in trouble if you're a teenager. That's what it sounds like to me.
Well, the Baptists kind of do that on a small scale with summer camps now.
Right. Well, yeah, and a lot of other groups have summer camps too. Yeah. Usually the summer camps now are youth-oriented camps, but you have adult things too. And there are still groups who have organized camp meetings today and have campgrounds, places that churches own that are called campgrounds, and they go there usually in the summer, for a week or something like that today. It's a more structured thing now than it was back in those days. In those days, a 10 or 12 day camp meeting was something that just kind of happened. Now they planned the meeting, but sometimes they would fizzle out after 2 or 3 days when you just didn't have the spirit.
They have retreats now, I guess is what.
You can have retreats, yeah. Yeah, camp meeting sounds a little hayseedy for, the United Methodists today probably aren't going to have a camp meeting, but they might have a retreat. I don't know. The United Methodists have sort of, for a lot of them, I think it would be hard to imagine that their heritage is in that kind of, those early 19th century camp meetings. Because they're very respectable nowadays. And in the early 1800s, Methodists were sometimes the poorest people in the community. They were the common people, unlike today. Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions about this? Okay. All right, I think we're going to take a break.